The Life of Vardas. The heirs of Lepidus write. The Lepidian librarian has charged us with researching further the story of Vardas, paragon and exemplar, and his investigations surrounding Mikal. Hazel Pony expressed the hope that these findings would give new insight into identifying poisons in our own fields. Vardas taught to seek out falsehoods and expose the truth. And so the Lepidian librarian asks us to hold his own story to this scrutiny, because we must be prepared to challenge what we know. What everyone knows. We mostly know Vardas through the tales of their exploits. Their staunch companion and friend Ion recorded many of their endeavours in pre-Imperial Varushka, especially Temeshwar, which at the time was obviously a Varushkan rather than League city. Vardas was active a century or more before Maria Ivanova, last boyar of Temeshwar, made the fateful decision to tie the fortunes of her city to that of Sarvos and Tasato. From the stories of Ion, however, it is clear that Temeshwar is already a powerful settlement in the north. The best guess is that these stories took place at least a century before the foundation of the empire. Very little is known about his youth and upbringing. Some accounts claim he is the earliest of the true Varushkans, but this perception is extremely unlikely given the timing, as any historian could point out. It is most likely based on a claim Ion makes several times that Vardas combines the iron-hard will of the Vard and the cleverness of the Ushka to exceed both, as the mountain exceeds the forest. He was an excellent hunter and tracker, and would turn the senses honed by a youth in the dangerous forests of Varushka into the superlative capabilities of an expert observer. He was a natural master of almost any craft or endeavour he turned his hands to, save music. There are several humorous asides in Ion's accounts of Vardas about his frustration at being unable to master the flute or the mandolin. As a Varushkan with a keen interest in rooting out truth and corruption, it is surely no surprise that he trained as a warden, in a fellowship known as the Lanterns of the Forest. In time, he split from the Lanterns and formed his own fellowship, which Vardas apparently named the Will and I. Ion mentions several members in his tales who come to help Vardas in particularly challenging scenarios. One such scenario is the adventure in which Ion first makes the acquaintance of the Warden and writes of his investigations. Along with two colleagues, Vardas uncovers a sinister cult of anarchists enthralled to the false virtue of freedom named the Fire Starters. They had been capturing innocent citizens of Temeshwar and trading them to a monstrous sovereign in the woods near Delev. Vardas expertly tracks them to their lair, rescues Ion and several others before they can be sacrificed, and manages to defeat the risen sovereign in a riddling contest that ultimately leads to the monster's destruction. Ion and Vardas soon become fast friends, travelling everywhere together. Their relationship remains platonic, as near as can be told from both Ion's writings and those of most of the hagiographers who follow afterwards. Ion, however, has a number of ill-starred romances, with ladies they encounter on their challenging adventures in the north, and later in more distant parts of what will today be the Empire. The adventure stories. Many of Vardas' stories that survive to this day are structurally very similar. He becomes aware of a danger, mystery, or threat, often one that others have overlooked or that has been dismissed by the authorities. He bends his exceptional skills and peerless reasoning to tracking down and dealing with those responsible. A key moment in most of these stories comes when Vardas notices something inconsequential that subsequently becomes instrumental in revealing a guilty party, giving him a strong reputation for vigilance, attention to detail, and near supernatural insight into the workings of the human mind. Well-known stories include the exposure of a plot to assassinate the Boyar of Temeshwar, Irina Belkanov, thwarted by the revelation that a certain birthmark is in fact paint, the machinations of a twisted winter coven that kidnaps and murders people as part of a foul rite intended to honour the voice of the pines, who in turn fills the dead with malign spirits to serve as miners for a corrupt mine owner. The recovery of a stolen journal containing damaging secrets for an Earl Sunrisen, whose house is clearly lightly fictionalised, and of course any number of plots by the wicked Mikal and his cult of anarchists. At this point, we might wish to pause for a moment to consider that while Vardas is clearly insightful, clever, and vigilant, he is still a product of his time, as was Ion. Several of their stories contain depictions of orc slaves that we, with our modern sensibilities, would consider extremely inappropriate. They rarely actually appear in the tales, but when they do, they are either savage, murderous, brutish monsters, or beaten down slaves. And Vardas wastes no time explaining to Ion that it is right and good that this is the case. Ion enthusiastically agrees. Unsurprisingly, these stories are either struck from the canon by modern writers or sometimes rewritten, and a certain amount of scholarly ink has been spilled trying to explain why they are not as bad as they appear. We, however, are true archivists, and I think it is safe to admit that these stories are uncomfortable, serve no purpose, and can be left in the past where they belong. Mikal. Many of Vardas' tales involve a man named Mikal, corrupted by the false spiritual power of anarchy. They clash several times, but Mikal always manages to escape at the last minute, often by sacrificing one of his minions or supposed allies. In one case, he literally hurls a foolish wise one, who has been helping shelter him into Vardas' path, tripping him and allowing Mikal to escape through a secret passage to a hidden underground river. In another, Mikal has used night magic to create 6 identical doubles who all assail Vardas and Ion together. The real Mikal is exposed when Vardas spots a certain detail involving blood splashes on his sleeve. But, nonetheless, he manages to evade the grasp of the master investigator. Mikal is also apparently involved in the death and alleged ascension of Vardas. The story is one of the best known. Having apparently caught and defeated Mikal, the anarchist escapes into the labyrinth. But rather than let him go, an injured Vardas chooses to pursue him into the embrace of death, urging the grief-stricken Ion to shoot him with his own bow. Before the chronicler can do so, Vardas ascends bodily, proving beyond doubt his paragonhood and inspiring Ion to make sure all the tales of the Warden's vigilance endure to inspire later generations. Then, as we know, some 35 years before the foundation of the Empire, Vardas is recognised first as an exemplar and later as a paragon by the Highborn Assembly, a decision that is later echoed and reinforced by the early Imperial Synod. After Vardas, Ion goes on to have adventures of his own, in which he seeks to emulate Vardas' methods, but they are much less well regarded and less influential. In the reign of Empress Enea, there was an attempt to have Ion recognised as an exemplar of vigilance, although this was hotly contested by the Loyalty Assembly, who, after the defeat of the recognition, would go on to raise their own judgment, recognising Ion as an exemplar of their virtue. A second attempt was made by the Vigilance Assembly in the reign of Empress Giselle. In both cases, ultimately the Imperial Synod concurred with the Highborn Synod, that Ion was not truly an exemplar, but that he would likely achieve that status or the status of paragon in his following life. Inspiration. The paragon is well known across the Empire, especially in Varushka and the League. A number of investigators, wardens, militia, sheriffs, and the magistrates look to Vardas as an inspiration, both in his methods and his staunch opposition to the forces of chaos, personified in the stories by the malignant Mikal. Vardas and Ion made a pilgrimage to Bastion. Although there are no surviving records of their visit, they were involved in thwarting an attempt by Mikal to trick several staunch highborn priests into spreading the force of anarchy in the White City. Mikal escapes, the priests are exposed and condemned by the Highborn Synod, who praise Vardas for his vigilance and courage. Again, sadly, no records of these judgments survives. This is perhaps not a surprise given the time involved and the Nikovarian barrier. Vardas is also recognised for the sign of salvation. The stories recount how he saved a truly inordinate number of people from falling into wickedness. And many of the tales end with him delivering a pithy line or 3 about the importance of being alert to treachery and false friends, credited with bringing them to the virtues through vigilance. Mikal and Vardas. Mikal is a perennial foe of Vardas. The two are polar opposites. Vardas, honest, upstanding, sincere, focused, dedicated to doing what he thinks is right and dispelling falsehood and wickedness. He fights with a small number of allies who respect and love him. Mikhail, deceptive, cruel, jealous, unreliable, treacherous, destructive. Dedicated to doing whatever he desires and urging others to do the same. Gathering disposable pawns who he discards whenever it suits his schemes. Ion dubbed his followers the Firestarters, for their love of burning buildings and people who get in the way with equal enthusiasm. In some of the later stories, they take on that moniker themselves. In Ion's dialogue, Mikhail regularly uses fire as a metaphor and makes any number of fire-themed puns when he is gloating about a scheme he believes has succeeded. Just before Vardas reveals how he has seen through the plan and exposed its weakness. The two seem, however, to be evenly matched. Vardas' incredible reason is balanced against Mikhail's cunning, and in many cases, unbelievable luck. There are a few discredited essays that suggest Mikhail's amazing good fortune may be indication of some kind of boon or blessing from an eternal power, perhaps Basilius Flint or the Whisper Gallery, and it is not until Vardas finds some way to thwart that boon that he is able to defeat Mikhail. Sadly, if that is the case, then the story that explains how it was achieved did not survive the burning of the libraries. For the librarian alone. Librarian. If you have read this far, I urge you to stop reading. Burn the remainder of this document. What has gone before is the product of a little scholarship, and we judge it sufficient to fulfill your request in a way that will raise no questions when it is published. What follows is solely for your eyes, and again, I urge you to cease reading. I am Nebyuk, of the heirs of Lepidus, an elder of our sect, and I take full and sole responsibility for the words that follow. I hope you understand that few of my colleagues know what I'm about to share with you. In the autumn of 381 YE, one of my colleagues came to Anvil to speak to the benefactors of Highguard. They had secured our services to explore the lives of the paragons and exemplars. This was some time before the Lepidean University was raised, you understand. During that meeting, my colleague shared with the benefactors that early investigations into Vardas had suggested the paragon might be in fact entirely fictional. In the way of an archivist, he asked for guidance. Would the benefactors wish us to continue our research? They wisely chose to ask us to focus our attentions elsewhere. We duly did so. Unfortunately, the evidence we had uncovered already existed. Only myself and my late colleague, Richard of Lepidus, have full awareness of the document we uncovered and its contents. And once I have committed this transcript to paper, my intention is to burn it, as it should have been burned 5 years ago. The Vision of Il Volpe. There is another piece of evidence we have pointedly ignored in this writing, and that is the transcript of the vision of Lorenzo La Volpe of the Bloody Butchers Guild and the exemplar Osren of House Orzel who accompanied him. That vision is recounted in the 5th volume of Echoes of the Labyrinth, and I believe, sadly, that it confirms our suspicions about Vardas. I will assume you are familiar with the account recorded here. The visionary appears to be a boyar, sitting in judgment over the anarchist Mikhail, advised by a magistrate and a wise one. The magistrate in the vision, I believe, is Ion. The name is recounted as Iona, or Jorna, or Yana, and I think it is reasonable to believe that the visionary misheard Ion. The visionary themselves we believe to have been Ivan Ilyich, a boyar von Temeshwar at the time when Ion and Vardas were alive. One clue I think cinches it is the visionary's question about the virtues. Ivan Ilyich was greatly touched by a highborn wayfarer in his youth, and became one of the earliest well-known converts to the way in the north, remembered by historians even today for his even-handed wisdom and pride in his sometimes ruthless people. The vision mentions that Iona, Jorna, Yana, Ion, is a magistrate. That also confirms our suspicion as to whose court this is. You must not make the mistake of thinking that the magistrates of Temeshwar in pre-imperial times were at all similar to the magistrates we have today. They were a distinctly Temeshwari invention, being responsible for maintaining good order in the city and its environs, similar to any number of modern imperial titles such as the various bailiffs of the marches. The role was auctioned biannually, and while prosperous citizens would usually avoid taking the title, those with ambitions would often scrape together the money to win the auction. And by doing so, not only enrich themselves through bribes and fines, but gain access to the ear of the boyar. But I digress. The vision suggests that Mikhail is Vardas. That Vardas had somehow become tangled up with the Whisper Gallery, had made some kind of deal with them, and in the process become Mikhail. Astonishing. Unbelievable. The claim that Mikhail is Vardas comes from the magistrate Iona, Jana, Yana, Ion, and I feel that makes it immediately untrustworthy, not to mention unlikely. Ion's own accounts speak of a decade-long rivalry between Vardas and his nemesis that spans almost the entire continent. It seems very unlikely, even with the gaps in imperial scholarship that are Nikovar's legacy, that Mikhail achieved the notoriety and destruction attributed to him and his followers in barely a year. Not impossible, of course, but it simply does not ring true. Worse, presumably the Wise One and the Magistrate himself would have met Vardas. They know of his exploits, seem unsurprised when he is mentioned. Yet nobody seems interested in discussing whether the prisoner Mikhail resembles, or does not resemble, Vardas, as if nobody knows what the man looks like. I apologize. My writing is becoming heated. To explain, I need to tell you another story. The Other Vision. Il Volpe's is not the first past life vision to concern Vardas, and by extension, Mikhail. This is the evidence that came to the heirs of Lepidus in 381 YE as we began our explorations of Vardas. A journal from the time of Emperor James, written by Ezekiel of Cyrene. Ezekiel was a well-respected magister and a regular visitor to Anvil. He served for 4 years as gatekeeper of Pride, and when he finally retired, he was granted a dose of true Liao with which to have his own past life vision. He writes of how touched he was that his colleagues wished to honour him by letting him experience firsthand what he had helped so many others to do before him, and how he hoped that it would provide him greater insight into where his path would lead him in the future. What follows is a transcript, as close as I can make it, of the relevant section of Ezekiel's journal, with a few annotations. The Vision of Ezekiel. I am stricken, and I know not what to say. After the vision, I spoke privately with Verena Kashalovich, and we agreed that it would serve nobody to reveal the truth of the vision. I am desolated. My heart is broken. What is the purpose of showing me this past? What greater good is served by it? We have said only that in a past life, I was a bravo in pre-imperial times. There is some interest from historians who wish to know my impressions of old Temeshwar. I have discovered that I have a great facility for dissembling, telling as much truth as possible and keeping actual fabrication to a minimum. As far as everyone, even my own chapter mates, are concerned, in a previous life, I was a poor gambler, faced with a choice between revealing a scandalous truth and personal ambition, who chose ambition. Everyone seems to believe our story. There are some gentle jibes at my expense that I could only be so upright in this life as a consequence of having been so dissolute in my last. I bear them with good grace. Verena and I have sworn an oath, and I know Verishkans take oaths seriously. I can only hope that writing here does not violate that oath. but I must find some way to exorcise the demons that run through my head, that make me doubt where before I knew only the certainty of the virtues. When I opened my eyes after the ceremony, I found myself in a house of ill repute, a tavern or an inn tap room. I at first took the people around me for pre-imperial Varushkins, but Verena quickly appraised me of the fact that we were in Temeshwar, and that some of the people nearby were talking about Mikhail and the fire starters. I recognised the name of Mikhail, of course, but Verena explained a few details anyway, although I confess they went over my head because I was busy drinking in all of these details, experiencing for the first time what it was to be someone else in another time. On the table before me were several empty tankards, some empty and some half full, and I confess I felt a little inebriated. There were also cards on the table, as if I were in the middle of a game. As I became restless, wondering what this relative calm might portend, a stanza took up a song I was unfamiliar with, about the perils of hubris, which I found a little unsettling. The landlord or barman came over to clear the empty mugs off the table, and commiserated with me that the legal complications around my mother's will were not going well, and he hoped I and my family would be able to find a place to live once we were evicted. Before I could ask any follow-up questions, the bar person whisked away, and a young man sat down at my table. He drank from the tankard in front of his chair and engaged in some ribbing and jibbing as young people often do. I learnt from this that my name was Vanya, and this fellow was an acquaintance who I owed an amount of money to in gambling debts. He made jokes about how I was unlucky in love as I was at cards, and he made fun of my attempts to better myself. And if I am honest, I became a little angered by his mockery, and Verena had to remind me that it was not me this man mocked, but a person I had been in another time. In the course of our exchange, the man revealed himself to be Ivar Olyankovic Nathalova, or something similar. He spoke very fast. He was being smug about the fact that he did not write under his own name. I did not immediately appreciate the cleverness of what he was saying, but in retrospect, it is so obvious. I-O-N. He was crowing that his pen name was just his initials. Ivar seemed to be what the League would consider a mountebank, but obviously flavoured by several centuries of distance and a strong tang of Varushka. He was feeling flush, because he had sold a new tale to the printers, but he had already spent his advance and wanted to further borrow money from me. "I can't believe I'm getting away with it," he laughed, and ordered new drinks for both of us. The barman served us at our table, and the last piece of information fell into place. In a soft tone, the barman asked my friend to send his regards to the great warden Vardas, and let him know that if he ever came to this inn, he would have the best of everything without ever needing to pay. Ivar lapped it up, and confirmed that he would pass that on, but through clever words got the landlord to agree to give us both a fine room and a good meal, in Vardas' name. After the landlord left, Ivar crowed about how nobody seemed to realise he had taken the most recent tale from a story he had heard about a warden fellowship in Karov, who had faced a Master Dubik. Verena whispered that this was a Varushkan wolf, a little like a Valorn spawn that feasted on blood, and burned a forest to destroy it. He had simply dressed up the story and inserted Mikhail and the Firestarters as working with Dubik, and it was selling like warm bread in a cold winter. I realised then that Ivar was very drunk and speaking without considering his words. I took this opportunity to ask him more questions, and with every answer my heart fell further. It was at this point I realised with a certainty who I was speaking to, a moment before Verena shared her own suspicion. He had made Vardas up. He had stolen the stories of a dozen other wardens and heroes, packed them in melodramatic language, and plenty of little details to appeal to the readers, and sold them as actual adventures he had had with the amazing Vardas. People want to believe in heroes, he said. They'll swallow the tallest tale more readily than a true story if it tells them something they want to hear. I asked him why he was telling me this, and, drunk as he was, he grinned even wider. Because first of all, nobody will believe you, he said. And second off, because you need me more than I need you. A word from me and you'll be dragged off to the Ratman's Gate as a debtor. And then who will look after your poor mother, and your poor sister, and your sister's little boys with winter coming in? Verena tells me that Ratman's Gate is most likely a reference to Ratibor's Gate, a place in Temeshwar used as a prison and built by the famous boyar who, I confess, I had not heard of before this. He then slapped a hand companionably around my shoulder and in a drunken slur told me that if I knew how to keep my mouth shut and which pipers to pay, then once he was sworn in as the summer magistrate in a few days, he'd make sure that my own petition to the boyar to settle my mother's will would go in my favour, and all of our worries would be over. We would, he said, go far together, as long as I remembered who my friends were. It seemed that Ivar smirked at me expectantly, and I realised that I stood at a crossroads. If I denounced Ivar, and his assessment of my position was correct, then I would gain little, and this person I had been would suffer greatly, as would those who relied on them. If I kept my silence, then this unpleasant man would help me achieve this ambition I sought that would secure prosperity for my dependents. I blustered for a moment, and Verena, unheard by any in the inn, of course, advised me to look into my heart and do what I thought was right. In the end, I shook Ivar's hand and told him his secret was safe with me, and that together we would do great things. Verena said afterwards that she was surprised at my decision. She was sure I would choose honesty in exposing a fraud over self-interest. But I explained to her afterwards that I could not tolerate the idea of this person's family suffering if I made the wrong decision. That if I remained in a position to moderate the behaviour of Ivar, it might lead to a better outcome. But secretly, all I could think of was that miserable childhood winter where the rats got into the chapter grain stores, and I could not condemn innocent people to experience that fate again. So, there we have it. Vardas does not exist. Ivar Olyankovich Nathalova, Ion, was worse than a chronicler. He was a fraudster who stole other folks' heroism and passed it off as his own by proxy of this Vardas he had created. Returning, I was in a daze, and Verena took charge, ensuring we were given time alone so I could recover from my experiences. There was little question of us telling the truth about what had happened, and for a moment I felt like I was experiencing a second dreadful test of virtue. I still dwell on whether I made the right choice, but it seemed so clear-cut at the time. Vardas is an inspiration. His tales give others faith in vigilance, teach lessons, give folk the ambition to rise to his example, remind them of the importance of seeking out threats and defeating them. They are a source of pride for so many. I cannot and will not shatter that inspiration. Verena agreed, although her motivation was a little different to mine. And we swore our oath. Already I feel a little quieter in my soul writing these words. I have shed the tears that have been within me for 2 months now, and I think in this at least I have done the right thing. Pouring it out has helped the pain of it pass from me a little, but I cannot return to Anvil. This experience has broken my heart. Every time I speak to people, I feel like a liar, even though the topic is almost never my vision. Every time I see the Cardinal of Vigilance, I cannot look them in the eye and excuse myself from the conversation. I will take this secret to the labyrinth with me and I urge you to burn this journal after my death, because despite all the efforts of the virtuous, these poisonous truths have a way of coming out. In summary and conclusion, the provenance of the journal is without question. Ezekiel of Serene is a real person, their journal is real, and they recount the vision they believe they had. Verena of Verushka is real. She clearly had a stronger heart than her highborn friend, and continued to be involved in the politics of Anvil until her death in 282 YE, serving briefly as the Cardinal of Ambition. She never spoke with the vision she guided, but never guided another. The vision of Ezekiel might cast a different light on the vision of Ilvolpe, but I refuse to draw conclusions. Mikhail was not Vardas because the vision of Ezekiel tells us that Vardas was not real. Why Iona, Jorna, Yana, Ion is so desperate to claim that he is, I do not wish to speculate. Perhaps you, librarian, can bring some reason to this tale, assuming you have read this far. In conclusion, Vardas is not real. There are many stories and reams of writing about those stories. Mikhail was real, but the names of those who fought against him are lost, obscured by Ion and his lies. We cannot even be sure how much of what we know about this monstrous blasphemer is true and how much is exaggerated fiction. The inspiration of Vardas is real, however. We can, I hope, both agree on that much, at least. Coda. During the summer solstice, Nebyuk of the heirs of Lepidus formally resigned their position and travelled to Rykos, joining the Welcomers Beacon chapter in Longshire.